This is Tommy's Outdoors 131, and I feel like this episode is kind of special. First of all, because we are going to talk about lowland raised bog, and bogs are center of attention recently because of their capacity to store carbon as well as release it. And this is a subject I feel like many of you will be very interested in. And second reason why this episode is special is that our guest is Simon Gray, who is a senior technical officer at Ulster Wildlife. And Simon is a listener of a podcast. So it was a great pleasure to welcome Simon to the other side of the set, let's say, and have him in front of a mic for this episode of the podcast. And I'm sure, Simon, you're listening to this. So it was a great pleasure to have you on the show. Folks, so like I said, we're going to talk about lowland raised bog, and this is another part of the work package of the CANN project. As you know, we have this series of episodes related to CANN project. And today we are going to talk about bog rehabilitation, and we're going to touch on all the other aspects of bog rehabilitation, not only rewetting and blocking drains, but also about invasive species like rhododendron, for example, fight with the rhododendron. Obviously, we're going to talk about rewetting. We're going to talk about predator control as well, kind of contentious subject, which some people are really unhappy about predator control, and some people are pointing out that this is absolutely necessary for the survival of very endangered species of birds, waders, like, for example, curlew. We're going to talk about curlew as well on this episode of the podcast. So I am sure you will find a lot of interesting things and interesting information in this podcast. And folks, if you want to comment or express your opinions, the best way to do that is to email me. And if you don't know what is my email address, well, you can subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of this show or in my Twitter profile. So subscribe to the Tommy's Outdoors newsletter, and you will not only get notifications about the new episodes and everything that's going on, but you can also just hit the reply to that newsletter, and that email will get straight to my inbox, and I will read and respond to you. I'm assuring you that I'm going to do that. Also, if your maybe newsletter is not your thing, you can leave the comment on their YouTube video. Just a reminder that this podcast is also presented in a full video version on YouTube, and you can leave the comment on the YouTube video. That's also a great way to get in touch and ask questions or just leave the comments. And before I let you enjoy this episode of the podcast, just a reminder to leave a 5-star rating on Apple and Spotify. If you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, 5-star rating is a great help for me and for the podcast, and I greatly appreciate each and every one of you who already left their 5-star ratings. And subscribe to the newsletter and enjoy the podcast. Simon, welcome to Tommy's Outdoors. Great to have you on the show. And I know that you're a fan of the show. You're a listener.
I am indeed. Yeah, this is why it's so weird. It's so it's strange being on a show that you've listened to before and you've heard other people on, and then suddenly you're actually on talking. It's kind of strange. Yeah, it's a great show. Really love it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it's so great to, have a guest and then find out that, you're actually also a listener. So that's awesome. Listen, man, we are here today to talk about lowland raised bog, and which is part of the CANN project. And the CANN project, CANN stands for Collaborative Action for a Natural Network. And people who want to learn more about this project can go back to one of the previous episodes where we had an introduction with Abby McSherry about what the CANN project is. And today we're going to specifically focus on lowland raised bog work package. But before we get into that, Simon, can you give our listeners an introduction, who you are and what you do in this CANN project, and maybe also, how it happened, what were your career that you ended up working on this project?
Right. That's going right back to the beginning sort of thing. So my role is that I work for an organization, a nature conservation organization called Ulster Wildlife, which is a partner in the CANN project. We're based in Northern Ireland. And we do a whole host of different things. But within the CANN project, then I look after a number of raised bog sites, raised bog special areas of conservation, kind of mostly within the west of Northern Ireland, so in and around like Tyrone, County Tyrone mainly, but other ones dotted around the country. And as well as that, I focus a bit of time on, I help out some colleagues on Culca Mountain down in the southwest. But on the raised bog side of things, then everything from managing contractors with huge diggers out on site doing restoration work to controlling invasive species to doing hydrological monitoring, doing vegetation monitoring. It's kind of like a catch-all, like a jack of all trades kind of position. To be honest, you end up doing all sorts of strange stuff. I mean, literally just before I came here, I was cutting up rhododendron with a chainsaw in a yard, and that was after trying to make charcoal out of the rhododendron, which is very cool. But I'm going off on a tangent. But yeah, I kind of came to this. I started off in the project then about 3-4 years ago. Must be about 4 years ago now, and I previous to that had kind of worked in similar kind of positions. I'd been based out in Fermanagh for the previous sort of 3 or 4 years. And I've been working on kind of peatland management and land management and working with farmers and recreational management, so managing access and kind of sensitive habitats as well. Yeah, very, very cool, very, very interesting stuff. And I love it. Like I would not rather be doing anything else. I've ended up, your parents always tell you, go and do something that you love, and I'm lucky enough that I've ended up doing exactly that.
So that's a kind of question that I'm always asking, and you obviously know because you're a listener, so you know what's coming next. Because I always asking like, how did you ended up doing what you love? This is awesome. So from the day one, you knew that this is kind of stuff that you want to go after, or is it like shaped later on in life?
I think it's kind of shaped a little bit. So I mean, like I've always had a passion for the outdoors and nature and wildlife. That's always been there. So from like early ages. I mean, I was just saying to somebody the other day, it's funny how it comes like full circle because my mum and dad would have always been very into the outdoors, and we would have spent a lot of time on somewhere like Rathlin Island over just off the north coast of Antrim. And I just remember like them saying to me and my brother, like, oh, come on, we're going to go out for a walk. And, like when we were maybe like 10 or something, we were like, no, I don't want to go for a walk. I want to sit here and play the Game Boy. But then it's strange. You go through a kind of like phase in early adolescence where like stuff like that's not cool. And then gradually you come around again and you're like, oh my God, I absolutely love all this. Like it's strange. So then I got into my later teens and I got very back into like hill walking and just generally into photography and wildlife again. And went and studied zoology at university over in Scotland, and then gradually I've just honed into. I've always been a big fan of kind of remote places, and bogs tend to be remote. So, it's kind of evolved into that and honed into that as I've gone on in life. But I've ended up in the right place, so to speak.
Very good. It's and now you're also in the right place on Tommy's Outdoors podcast. That's fantastic.
Yes.
So let's talk about the lowland raised bog. And my first question is, what is lowland raised bog? What is the difference between raised bog and some other bog like blanket bog or whatever, and maybe wider, what are the types of bogs?
There's often quite a lot of confusion, and the term raised bog often causes quite a lot of confusion when compared to blanket bogs. So blanket bogs are the ones that we get in our uplands, so our mountains and our hills, and they're literally called blanket bogs because they blanket the landscape. That's actually why they have that name. So you tend to get those in areas where there's high rainfall above a certain altitude, and gradually, actually, if you take like Ireland as an example, then the rainfall and the altitude kind of relationship, it kind of changes as you move further west. So the further west you get, then the lower you get blanket bog. So you start off over in somewhere like Antrim on the east coast or Wicklow, you only get blanket bog up on the tops of the hills. And then gradually, as you move over to somewhere like Galway or Donegal, then you get blanket bog right down at sea level, and that's just because it's wetter. But then lowland raised bogs, they basically form in depressions or hollows in the landscape. And if you think of whenever the ice retreated after the Ice Age, so say in around 13,000 years ago, the ice sheet was retreating off Ireland, and basically then we were left with lots of glacially sculpted landscapes, and they had all these little depressions in between things like drumlins and everything. And it's somewhere like the Midlands of Ireland or in and around like the centre around Lough Neagh in Northern Ireland. Very, very indicative of this kind of landscape. And they were left with these big pools of water in them. Stagnant water, didn't have anywhere to go. And gradually, as a lot of people will be aware, like stagnant water gets scum accumulating on it fairly quickly. And if you just really think of that long term, eventually you get like a skin forming over this pool. And then that vegetation gradually just starts to grow and grow and grow. The skin gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And then you get this moss, this key species of moss, or key type of moss called sphagnum moss, which starts to grow in these kind of environments. And it basically does this thing where it dies at its feet. We think of it like a layer, dies at its feet, and it grows at its head. And eventually then you get this buildup of organic matter below the surface, and it just keeps on growing and growing and growing. And it gets to the point then whereby actually that layer of vegetation, it can't get water from the sides or underneath anymore. It has to just get water from rainfall. That's the only place it gets from. And then it becomes a dome. So eventually it becomes raised, particularly in the middle, and that's where the term raised bog comes from. So you think of these kind of places that they used to be basically open water, and then they've gradually developed this skin of vegetation. But again, thinking long term here, so this skin of vegetation grows at about somewhere in around a meter every 1,000 years. And so we've been roughly sort of 10,000 years, 13,000 years since the ice retreated, depending on where you are. So in some of these sites, we've got 10, 11 meters of that vegetation, which is peat, which is built up. So
so later on, it turns into peat.
Yeah. So yeah, as that vegetation that's died at the base, and it's mainly sphagnum moss, but it's other bits and pieces that are locked in there. It compresses and it compacts, and that's what turns into peat, and that's ultimately where we get turf and everything else. So, yeah. So if you think of that, then 10,000 years to get 10 meters, and some of these places, like, they are super deep, you know. But yeah, that's basically what a raised bog is, and then comparison to a blanket bog. And then we get fens, which are a completely different thing altogether. Then, and there, if you think like a depression in the landscape, but they actually get water fed into them from underneath, but they still accumulate peat, but it's nowhere near the same sort of speed and the same process exactly as raised bogs or as blanket bogs. But we're very lucky in Ireland because we have a lot of raised bog. In fact, actually we only have a tiny percentage of what we used to have, but we still have a lot.
And was that a thing? I think I remember there was like in prior glaciation or during glaciation, it was like a massive lake in the middle of Ireland.
I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, I would believe it, because really, if you think of like the Midlands, Ireland's actually colloquially kind of known geographically as being almost like a bowl.
Yeah.
So if you think about where all the mountain ranges are across the island of Ireland, like you've got Sperrins and Donegal and Galway and Kerry and everything, you basically go round and you'll hit mountain ranges most of the way around the outskirts. And then you've got that Midlands sort of depression in the middle. And it is, yeah. I mean, it would make complete sense if there was just.
I think that was like a massive lake that then was turned into the, like you said, the bog and the peat. So that peat then turns into what?
Yeah. So I mean, effectively that peat it's carbon. I mean, if you think of it on the same kind of scale of coal is effectively organic matter, which has been locked away for a very, very, very long time, hundreds of millions of years. And it's very dense. And so that's why it's very good for burning. Turf is same kind of principle, but nowhere near the same. Or peat, turf kind of then is what you would call it peat whenever you've cut it.
Okay, so that was my question. Like, what is the difference between the peat and turf? So essentially, turf is peat cut out.
Effectively, yeah. So yeah, I mean, turf would be the colloquial name for any kind of peat which has been cut into briquettes or whatever it is, which is going to be used for fuel or for bedding for animals or for horticultural compost or whatever it is. Once it's been processed, it would tend to be called turf.
Okay.
Rather than
and
peat.
Tell me, what are the environmental conditions that needs to happen for a body of water starts to develop that skin and starts turning into peat? Because like not all bodies of water turning into bogs, right? Some of them just they're lakes or something.
So stagnation is the key thing. So basically, we think a lot of lakes that are lakes. We know them as lakes, and they're probably not going to change from being lakes. They tend to have an outlet somewhere and an inlet somewhere. They've got water moving into them, and then they've got water moving out of them. And then sometimes when you've got large bodies of water, then the action of wind and everything will actually prevent vegetation from accumulating on them. But when you think about whenever the ice age retreated, then these bodies of water were left, and they had literally nowhere to go. They sat there and they stagnated, and they would have probably evaporated and then risen again whenever the rain fell. But they didn't leave; they just sat there, and that's the kind of conditions that you need for the vegetation to gradually get in to growing out onto them. And it creeps from the edges. It's this kind of real, not quite geological timescale, but somewhere in between that and what we kind of know, where it gradually just seeps in from the edges until it meets, and then you get it growing up.
And there was one last thing that I got to ask about the terminology. You often hear about active raised bog. So what does that mean? Is the active means that process still is ongoing, and then are there like inactive bogs?
There definitely are. Yeah, so active raised bogs are basically ones which are still actively accumulating peat. So that process is still ongoing, as you say. So that process of growing at the head and dying at the feet is still continuing. Inactive bogs or inactive, any kind of inactive peatland, you can have inactive blanket bog, you can have inactive lowland raised bog, is basically where that process is stopped. And you need to have certain conditions present for that process to continue, and the key thing is wetness. To be honest, bogs like to be wet. If they're not wet, then they're not happy. So the metric, the kind of easy to understand metric that we would use is that you want the water table to be within 10 centimeters of the surface of the ground for 90% of the year. If you have that, then you're probably getting active peat formation. If you don't, then you're looking at inactive peat. So we have a lot of inactive peat, because what happens is that whenever you do things like drain bogs or burn them or overgraze them or whatever it is, then particularly the drainage, then you reduce that water table. You make it go well below what's required, and then you're not actively forming peat anymore.
Okay, that explains a lot of things, and that explains a lot of things about the draining and the rewetting the bogs, which we're going to talk about later on in this show, of course. Is there a way to turn inactive to active, or is it like after some time it's inactive, it's done, and you cannot make it active again?
There's definitely some cases whereby if it's been it's been really heavily modified and it's been inactive for a long time, then yeah, you get past like a point of no return. So there's some places whereby peat has maybe been really heavily improved and drained for like intensive agriculture or for some sorts of forestry or something. That peat's quite hard to get back once it gets past a certain point. But there's a habitat type which is known in Europe as degraded raised bog capable of regeneration, or still capable of regeneration, and that's really quite a key one, because that's the stuff which has been modified but can still definitely be brought back into active peat forming condition, and we have loads of that. So basically, if you think about a lot of those areas that would have been historically cut for turf, whether it was domestically or commercially, then there's quite a lot of those which still could be brought back into active peat forming condition if the particularly the right hydrological conditions were brought back. So that's where the rewetting comes in then, obviously.
Wow, that's very interesting. And okay, so I think we established what we're talking about, all the types of bogs, and kind of like a very simplified life cycle. So tell us, like, why bogs are so important. There are many aspects of the importance of bogs, like habitat, carbon capture, water quality, all those things. So if you can just go down the list and get into the more detail of the importance of those raised bogs.
Peatlands in general, and in an Irish context, then raised bogs are sort of top of that list. I've got a lot of limelight over the past wee while because of climate change, and the reason that they've got a lot of that limelight is because they are very, very important carbon stores. So, I mean, woodlands historically have been forests are the ones that have got a lot of the good press in terms of carbon storage. But peatlands have kind of been the less talked about cousin. But actually, all of the peat soils in the world they're only about 3% of the land surface of the globe, but they actually contain more carbon within them than all of the world's forests combined. So and it's quite easy to think about. So I mean, if you just think of a forest, like a forest got lots of trees in it, which is carbon is effectively just living stuff. So you got lots of trees in it, but within a forest you also got lots of air. Okay, but in a bog, I mean, it's literally just solid lumps of locked away living stuff. So it's almost like if you were to just take a woodland and mulch it and squeeze it down into a tiny little briquette. That's like a bog. So that's why they've got a lot of good press. The problem then with them is that when they're modified, then they release that carbon, and that's why they've got a lot of press recently in terms of rewetting. But because the rewetting then brings them back into the active state and then starts to sequester carbon. So that's the key thing about bogs, which makes them very different, is that, say, if you fell a woodland, which has locked up carbon then previously, then you go down from, say, just on a kind of simple metric, like say you would go from 10 to 0, then it's gone, but that's it, done deal. With a bog, if it's in a bad state, then you go to like -10, and it continues to be at -10 and keeps on taking that carbon, releasing that carbon, letting it out. Whereas if you re-wet it and restore it, then it actually goes to +10 continuously. It doesn't stop, it just keeps on going. So that's why they're like, it's almost worse than a lot of other habitats and other landscapes, because in a bad state, they're really actively working against us, but in a good state, they really actively work for us. So that's why they're very particularly important in terms of carbon. But as you listed there, I mean, they're really important for a whole host of other reasons. The other big one, which is had a bit of focus on it recently, is both water quality and flooding. So both lowland raised bogs and blanket bogs are really important in terms of filtering our water. So huge amount of our catchments for our major rivers start in these bog systems, these peatland systems. And if they're in a degraded state, then you tend to get more organic matter within the water, which actually needs to be cleaned out, taken out. Otherwise, we would have lots of brown water. And that costs quite a lot of money. Whereas if you have healthy bogs, healthy peatlands, they actually do that for you. So they save huge amounts of money, and it's that real textbook example of ecosystem services, something that nature does for free that we actively have to pay for if it's not in a good way. So they do that, but then also if they're in a good state, then they slow the flow of water off the landscapes. So that means that you get less flash flooding. So whenever the rain hits bogs, if it's in a bad state, flows into lots of drains quickly, rushes into rivers, then rushes into villages, into towns, and then you get flooding. If it's in a good state, then it hits the bogs and it soaks up, and it takes a lot longer to get off there. So it slows down that flash flooding incidence, and it actually means then that water takes longer to get through the system, and it makes it a lot safer. And then in terms of biodiversity, I mean, they're great. They're so good. Like, bogs are the only place that we actually get insectivorous plants here. I mean, we think of plants that eat animals, and we think of like Venus flytraps and those weird flowers out in the Amazon that smell like meat and attract flies and things like that there. But we actually have stuff like that exists here out on our bogs. Like lowland raised bogs are full of these things called sundews, and they're these tiny little plants that have like a little round face and then these tiny little sticky globules all over them, and they stick flies to them, and then they bend in and then they digest them with digestive juices. It's horrific, proper little shop of horror stuff. And yeah, there's lots of rare species that are at home only on bogs, and a lot of our really iconic species are so sort of linked to them. Things like curlew, and snipe and grouse, that sort of stuff, that species that hold a lot of cultural weight and weight in terms of the heritage of Irish communities and Irish tradition. They're often very closely linked to bogs, and a lot of them now have started to become quite rare. So conserving these sorts of places is really important for those kinds of species, So that's a whistle-stop tour of why bogs are important.
Yeah, curlew especially, like the situation in Ireland is pretty dire.
Yeah.
Do you have any insights on this? Because like a curlew is a wader. It depends how much water is it, or they're just nesting on the bogs and then feeding somewhere else.
It's a number of different things. With a curlew, it's almost like a bit of a perfect storm. Well, actually, a curlew is just kind of symbolic of a lot of situations that other breeding wader species are in that would have nested on these bogs. But yeah, they've suffered a lot. I mean, just for a CANN kind of example, there was a survey done on the fairy water bogs, which are this beautiful sort of stepping stone system of bogs in Tyrone in the 1980s, and they had quite a really significant population of curlew in that valley, and that was great in the 1980. I think it was 1985, and we then took part in a survey across the same sort of area in 2018. I think it was 2018, 2019, and there was none, not a single one. Somewhere like Moneygall Bog had 12 pairs of curlew breeding on the bog and around the bog, and whenever we did that survey on that site, there was none again. So they have just disappeared. But in terms of the reasons why they're disappearing, I mean, yes, one, drainage is a big problem, because the main reason why they nest out on bogs like this is partly because actually they're not that hospitable to predators, because they're not the handiest places to walk across if you're something like a fox or a badger, but also because the wet conditions tend to be quite good for invertebrates, so you get lots of bugs and beetles and things that survive in the wet conditions. So they're great, the wading birds, just like the curlew, like you would see them out on the beach probing in the sand, in the tidal kind of estuaries, do exactly the same thing out in the bog. They would probe in the soft mud looking for invertebrates, and the chicks particularly really enjoy that kind of the edge of those little wet bog pools where they get little spiders and little bugs. But if they're drained, don't get those wet conditions, so then nothing to feed on. So that's a major problem. But they're getting hit from all sides. Like, predators really do numbers on them, things like hooded crows and foxes and badgers, and that's a whole ecological sort of imbalance there that I could go on a massive tangent on. But and then fires and climate change is impacting them as well. You know, we're worried with certain species, things like not curlew as much, but things like golden plover, a really iconic breeding wader of our uplands and our bogs, is disappearing, and we're wondering whether or not climate change is actually just forcing them just off the edge. You know, they're very northern range species, so they're getting it from all sides, to be honest.
You know, like I wouldn't be that concerned if they're just distribution changes and they're still there and not here, but they're still there. That's one thing. But then if they cannot move for whatever reason and facing extinction, that's much worse. Listen, I know that we can go on this tangents, but I want to kind of like stick on this for 1 second. You mentioned that the predators are also major problem for waders, for curlew, and so on. So, what's your take on predator control, and whether, you know, because there is obviously a huge debate on the internet, right? About the predator control, whether it is, you know, there are typically two camps, you know, two extremes. One is like, no, leave them alone, nature needs to balance and whatever. But then you need to look at the, you know, why they're so successful and why because they're obviously so abundant, because they're benefiting from the human modified landscapes. And then there is another camp that, you know, you take a rifle and you go and you shoot everything you see moving that has four legs, and that's, you know, and that's deemed conservation, which by the way, you know, for people who are listening to that and want to get angry at me, I'm not saying that the predator control and this sort of controlling numbers cannot be, it all can be part of the conservation, but I feel like sometimes it's just like literally you shoot anything and I'm a conservationist. Like, no, you're not. So I'm wondering, like, from the perspective where you are and you're like in the epicenter working on that, like, you know, how do you see that situation, especially in Ireland? You know, how important is predator control? Is it like you know, top 5 of things that needs to happen, or is it like a down, you know, like a top 10, top 20 maybe in terms of you know, curlew and other those endangered species?
I think you really highlighted there a couple of minutes ago whenever you said that the situation with, say, curlew, just take curlew for example, is really dire. I mean, curlew are genuinely at risk of going extinct as a breeding bird species in Ireland in the next sort of 10 years, if efforts are really not made to protect them. And I feel very conflicted about it a lot of the time. I'm sure a lot of other conservationists do. You know, it's one of those situations whereby I don't want to use the phrase like, I mean, if you're going to make an omelette, you're going to break a few eggs sort of thing. But sometimes I kind of feel like it is like that. I don't like the kind of mindset that you're touching on there, of this, that, you know, things are vermin. You know, like foxes and crows or whatever it is, don't really have the same right to exist as a lot of other stuff, and we just like, you know, the nice beautiful golden plover sitting up there because it's nice, and not foxes and whatever. But the way that I kind of view predators, you said it yourself that certain species, very adaptive species, are doing very well because of the way that we have modified our landscapes and the way that we manage our landscapes. So they're doing great. So but it's based on the way that we manage the landscape, not because they're out of control. You know, it's not down to them really. And I think that species that are really at risk, and nobody can deny really, the data is there to say that that predators do have a significant impact on ground nesting birds in particular. That's clear. If we didn't do any kind of control or management of predators in the short term, there is a real risk that we would lose certain species. But the big thing that I would think about it is that it's not a long-term solution. And the metaphor that I kind of always say to people is that controlling predators to allow species like curlew or golden plover to persist and to breed is kind of like putting the bucket under the leak in the roof, but you're never fixing the leak. You know, you have to go back and you have to say, well, why is the roof leaking? We can't just continue to put the bucket under the drip and just let it fill up and then throw it away and then put it under again. Why is the roof leaking? And the roof is leaking because of the way that we manage our landscapes, and because our trophic systems, our species interactions are completely skewed. I was literally talking to somebody yesterday that we were saying about how there's certain species that we're missing here that would have a massive impact on some of those medium-sized predators and the corvids in the avian box that we just don't have. And I mean, I'm not talking about like we should have wolves and bears, and there's a whole other conversation there. But things like, I mean, I've read some great books that talk about species like goshawks. Goshawks are birds that would eat crows at big levels, or eagle owls, or even eagles themselves have massive impacts on how particularly mammals like foxes operate in upland areas. You know, they create a completely different atmosphere within these environments, and we don't have those. And I think that's where we need to start moving towards. Okay, yes, we maybe need to do some sort of control of predators in the short term so that we don't lose these species. But long term, what are we going to do so that we don't have to continuously just put the bucket under this leak? We need to start actually fixing the interactions between species so that we can leave them to it. Because if you leave them to it currently, the species will just go extinct. You know, that's inarguable, I don't think. But if we fix the interactions, then we can leave them to it. But that's not easy done.
Yeah, that's for sure. And you know, like you said, it's probably a material for another podcast or 5 on those on those interactions and all these things. What's your view on impact of sheep and livestock on curlew as well? Because then, you know, I'm kind of going back to another conversations, heated, of course, about, you know, that the impact of predation on foxes, badgers, whatever. But then it turns out that when it comes to nest failures and destroying nests, surprisingly, sheep has a big impact. Is that something that you can confirm? Is that something that you see in your work?
Trampling is definitely a big problem. It happens way more often than I think is ever really talked about. I think because the predator issue is so contentious, it gets talked about a heck of a lot more. The trampling is something which is also very, very difficult to manage at times, unless you literally fence off in nesting areas. But then you get into problems with the disturbance and everything. It is a problem, but the flip side of it is that if you didn't have grazing in certain landscapes, then probably those birds wouldn't be there. You know, I mean, if curlew, for example, in that case, if you didn't have them grazed by certain types of livestock at certain times of year, whatever it was, then the vegetation would probably get too tall, and the curlew just wouldn't breed anyway. So it's a bit of a catch-22. I think realistically, trampling of nests is something that always would have happened. You know, that birds that nest on the ground, they always run the risk of nests being trampled. That's just a given. Now, definitely, obviously, we have a lot more livestock and a lot more large herbivores out in the ground now than we would have done historically or prehistorically. So it's probably compounded. It definitely is compounded. But I think the grazing is a necessary tool there in order to allow those bird species to persist. Probably, well, not probably, definitely not on the scale that it currently is. I think if there was a lot less grazing in certain areas and probably a change in the certain type, then we would have less of a problem with trampling, and we would still have the benefits of the birds wanting to breed. So it's probably a problem of scale.
It's typical that no extreme. There is like seldom the extreme solution is the one that is correct. It's always like finding this middle line. It's finding this balance. Like it's not like, oh, these like take a sheep off the hill, gone. No, it wouldn't be good for like curlew. But then go ahead and graze like year round. That's not good either. So it's always, and this is the biggest difficulty, because finding balance is much more complex to implement and to explain than to explain the simple thing like, oh, gone 100%, or no, do this, and that's simpler. And that's why, okay, we covered a lot so far, and I think now it's a good moment to talk about actual CANN project and this piece of work. So as this part of the, I don't know if you guys using this term, work package, as a part of this work package or piece of work on lowland raised bogs. So what are you doing as part of a CANN project? What are the activities and what you're aiming to achieve, and also what you're aiming to achieve?
Okay, so basically, to kind of paint you the geographical picture, I mean, we have 8 raised bogs, lowland raised bog SACs, Special Area Conservation, across Northern Ireland that we're working on, and those are, I think we actually have one in every county in Northern Ireland. And the main aim of the project really was focusing on peatland and wetland habitats, designated sites that were in unfavourable condition. So unfavourable condition is basically a term which is used by the kind of the state bodies. So in Northern Ireland, we have Northern Ireland Environment Agency. In the Republic, then you've got National Parks and Wildlife Service. They use those terms based on a number of different metrics that they use to measure the health of the habitats. So on a peatland, you would be looking at certain things like whether it's very, very dominated by heather, for example, or if there was a lot of bare peat, or if there was signs of burning, or that sort of thing. If there's too much of those kinds of problems, then the site is brought into unfavourable condition, and you need to hit certain thresholds of those different variables in order to get it into favourable condition. So the main aim of our project was to try and move some of these sites, or all of these sites, towards favourable condition. We were never going to completely achieve getting them to favourable condition, but it was about that process of kickstarting them towards that end. So that entailed various different things on a variety of different sites. So I already mentioned there about rewetting, and drain blocking was probably the biggest key thing that we were doing across a lot of these sites. So I think overall we installed about 1,200. No, it was more than that. It was maybe about 2,500 dams across drains across these 8 sites. So a lot of these sites would have been drained historically for domestic turf cutting. So they would have drained them to dry out the bog to make it easier to cut turf for their houses locally. But in a lot of these cases, it hasn't been touched for 50, 60, 70 years. So the problem with it is that even though they haven't been actively cut for turf, the drainage systems are still there, and they're still impacting the site to still lower that water table and bring it into unfavourable condition. So realistically then, basically what we were wanting to do was block those drains. And when you block the drain, then when the water falls into it, it doesn't go anywhere, so the water table rises, and you get towards that Goldilocks zone of within 10 centimetres of the surface for 90% of the year. So that basically involves the really nail-biting process of bringing very heavy machines onto very wet ground. So I described it earlier on like a skin of vegetation. So the way that I say it to people whenever you're out onto these sites, and I mean, so if you picture in your head a 13-ton Bogmaster digger, right, out on somewhere that is effectively like a skin on a bowl of custard, that is really horrifying whenever you think about it. And whenever you're standing 50 yards away from a machine, and every time it swings around its boom, its bucket, you feel the ripple as it comes towards you, and it's honestly like being in a wave machine. It's insane. So, I mean, when you're walking across it, human being doesn't make that much of an imprint, but whenever something that size is on it, you get the real impression that you're literally standing on top of a thin film, which is this weird kind of in between of liquid and solid. It doesn't really fit in either box. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. And we use these huge machines to basically to create peat dams in most cases. So they dig out peat from a borrow pit, as it's called, next to the drain, and they then use that. They dig down into the really wet, solid peat, which is within the kind of reach of the water table, and they bund that into the drain to create a block, and then they put vegetation under the top, sods of vegetation under the top to bind it together, and that just acts like a block. And you basically get the machine going along every 10 meters and installing a new one of these, and before you know it, then you end up in the region of thousands. But it's incredibly exciting, but also terrifying at the same time. That's part of the reason why I love
it. No, that's so you're effectively running the risk that digger would drown in the bog.
That has happened to us on one occasion, yeah. And let's just say it's not the handiest thing to get a digger out of. As much as I said earlier on, maybe 10 meters of peat. So, like, there's bogs out there that have swallowed diggers completely, and they're still there. You know, they'll be preserved for generations to come to find and wonder why on earth they're out there. And we have had real worries at times where machines get into soft places, very soft places in the bog, and you see them sitting sort of like well below the surface. The tracks are well below the surface, but they're actually they have very wide tracks, and it's that kind of snowshoe mindset, you know, where you spread your weight over a very wide area. And we tend to use bog mats a lot, so the machines sit on these huge big oak mats, which spreads their weight across and makes it easier to get across. But even then, it's still nail biting. It really is terrifying, but it's so cool. And I was saying to somebody the other day, there's a really strange, almost childlike mindset when it comes to slowing up and blocking water. So, I mean, I've always remember whenever I was sitting on a beach, whenever I was a kid, and, you know, you get little streams coming down on the beach, and then you put sand in front of them and it slows it up, and then you get little pools. It's exactly the same thing, you know. So, like, whenever the digger puts in these bunds and you see the water going down there, it starts to build up. It's so, yeah, it really gets to like a proper childlike part of your mind that brings real joy. It's such a simple thing. You know, like whenever you go back to these sites and you see all these drains full of water and it's spilling out either side and everything, it's brilliant. It really is good.
Wow! I now that explains why those projects like CANN needs to be financed by the bodies like Interrig and so on, because you need money in case you drown a digger or something.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and some of these machines are expensive. Touch wood, cross fingers. Anyone that's got stuck so far, we've been able to get it out. But we've never actually lost one. But I should say that's not the only thing that we were doing on these sites. So, I mean, some of these bogs are under threat from a number of different things. And
yeah, but because we get there, while we on the subject of is it dangerous to walk? Is it possible for person walking on the bog to get in trouble?
It can be, yeah. I mean, I would. My first sort of reaction was there to say, "Oh no, it's fine," but like that's probably too blasé. I mean, there are situations whereby you could get very stuck. You know, realistically, it's very unlikely. 99% of cases you'd be able to walk across anywhere without having any problem. We have one of our sites, Balnahone Bog, just to the northwest of Lough Neagh. There, it's been really heavily drained in the past because it was going to be cut for turf, for commercial turf, but then it didn't in the end. And a lot of those drains have now been blocked, and they're these really narrow little drains that are quite hard to see. And actually, it's never really the soft spots that you need to worry about. It's actually falling into the drains, which is more of the risk. Okay. Because some of those can be, say, like 4 or 5 feet deep. And I mean, if you went in, you're away. You know, like you're properly down. But no, it's not that much of a risk. You know, it's not the kind of terrible, like mythical stories that probably they used to tell about bogs that people wandered in and then never came out. You know, that sort of stuff. It's
so in other words, you just don't want to be that guy who never come back from the bog. Okay, that would be
yeah. You never want to be that dude.
That would be stupid. Okay, that's fine. One last thing I want to on the subject of a draining and rewetting. Did you ever come across the problems or opinions that you are taking away the cultural heritage and we were kind of cutting for generations and this is part of what we do and so on and so forth? Or is it by the time you guys come in, all that aspect is already addressed?
I would say it's much closer to the latter. So I think we've definitely seen, because this project is obviously cross-border, so we work with a lot of partners that work in the Republic of Ireland, and the mindset in Northern Ireland compared to the Republic of Ireland is actually quite different, even though the history is very similar. I think recently there's been a lot more changes, and particularly the key change has been that domestic turf cutting, so people cutting turf for their own use, is minimal in Northern Ireland now. It's really small. Whereas I think there's still quite a big market for that in the Republic of Ireland. So in a lot of the cases that we worked on now, we had the benefit of working on sites that were scientifically designated. They were designated as special areas of conservation, and they had been for some time. So the people that owned that land, that owned those bogs, they were aware really of the importance of them, and they hadn't done anything to them for a long time. So actually, in a lot of cases, people barely even saw them really as their own ground anymore. It almost was just this land that you owned, but actually didn't do anything. So whenever we came to them and talked to them about blocking drains and rewetting, either we kind of got this serious kind of like not quite apathy, but almost to that extent, that people didn't really care that much. They were just like, oh, tear away. Yeah, do whatever you want. Because honestly, they really didn't even feel like it was theirs. It was just there. Or actually, we got real positivity. So, I mean, one site that we worked on, which is just outside Fintna, intro near Oma, landowners were really interested. Some farmers that were really keen, and we thought like, oh, this is brilliant. Actually, like they started seeing the bog as something really important again, rather than it being something that was almost like waste ground. I think that's a mindset that we very sort of easily fall into in a lot of cases, is that people do still view bog as waste ground, something that is useless. At best, it could be a dump somewhere where you could store stuff or throw stuff away. But that is starting to change. Whereas I think in the Republic of Ireland, there's still very much a sense that the domestic turf cutting is a sort of cultural right. That's very strong, particularly in the West and in the Midlands. Whereas I just don't think we have quite the same strength of feeling in Northern Ireland anymore. It's probably not long gone. I'm maybe talking a generation, if that. But it is definitely lesser here. So we didn't come up against anywhere near the same sort of struggles that maybe some other projects have.
Okay. That's good to hear. All right. So that's part of the turf cutting and rewetting and draining bogs. But you said that there's more that you do.
Yeah. So, I mean, the big problem with bogs is drainage and problems with the water table, but invasive species is a big problem. So the one that we would focus on, or we have focused on a lot in this project, is rhododendron.
Right.
Rhododendron is one of the long list of things that were brought in by the good old Victorians, who every conservationist would happily send to hell, because they effectively went all around the world, brought back all these beautiful plants and beautiful animals that they thought were amazing, and then released them into their home, where they then quickly escaped out into the countryside and run riot. So rhododendron is one of those plants which I'm sure you're well aware was brought in during that period, ornamental garden plant. And during the time whenever the estates were big, that they were largely kept in, the groundskeepers kept them in check. And that was grand, didn't get anywhere. Then the First World War came along, and a lot of the gamekeepers and the groundskeepers died, didn't come back. Rhodey got out of hand, and now it's blooming everywhere. And it really loves the acidic soil, the peaty acidic soil of the bog. So somewhere like Peatlands Park in Armagh, rhododendron has now got to the scale whereby it is almost like a physical wall. So you couldn't actually walk through it. So the problem with it isn't just that it it takes over areas. Well, it does. That is a big problem. But it grows in such a way that it actually blocks out light. So if you ever get the chance to walk in underneath the canopy of rhododendron bushes, there's nothing there. It's dead underneath. It's just a litter of dead leaves and bare soil. But it literally leaches toxic chemicals into the soil as well, which then kill other plants so that they can't grow. So in certain areas of Peatlands Park, we've got hectares and hectares of rhododendron, which have grown to the point now where it's just insane. So we, through this project, have been able to remove large areas of that, but it's a long-term game, because the big problem with it is that if you go in and you cut and treat it with some sort of herbicide and remove the material, rhododendron is a very vigorous plant, and it will still come back in many cases the next year. So actually the kind of best practice is that you go in and you cut and you remove and you treat, and then you go back the following year and you do the same. You cut any regrowth that comes back, and then you go back in a following year until you've come 3-4 years maybe, and then you might be quite sure that you've got rid of it. But it takes that kind of long-term vision, and big problem with that is that it takes money. So rhodie is a big problem. And then we've got cherry laurel, which is similar issue, and coniferous trees, which is a very big problem in peatlands in general. So somewhere like Moneygall, we have forestry plantations of Sitka spruce, which are nearby, and again the Sitka perfectly happy in that acidic bog. They get out onto there, they grow tall, and they actively reduce the water table because they suck up huge amounts of water. And that lowers the water table so that then you can't have that active peat formation anywhere where you have lots of trees.
Wow. So is it like they're almost, you can think of those Sitka trees as escapees from the plantations?
They are, yeah.
So there is a plantation and someone takes care of a plantation and then clear fell the plantation, but then some of them manage to spread on the bog and then nobody cares about them because they're on the bog and they keep, oh, wow.
Yeah, so that happens all the time. So, I mean, and one of the big problems with it is that if you try to sort of determine who's at fault, if you know what I mean, who's really responsible for these trees, then, I mean, it's come from seeds. So realistically, somebody could just say, well, you can't prove that didn't come from somewhere, 10 miles down the road, unless you're willing to do some really expensive genetic testing. So that means that, yeah, you end up with huge swathes of peatlands that have both lowland raised bogs and blanket bogs that have massive areas of coniferous trees on them that are growing all over the place, and nobody having the money or the resources to do anything about them, and eventually they'll just take over. So we removed, I think we took about 12 hectares of coniferous trees off Moneygall Bog out in the border between Tyrone and Donegal. And that was everything from trees that were sort of 10, 12 meters high, right down to little saplings that were just growing in abundance. You might have an area which is the size of a tennis court and you could have like 100 in there.
Yeah.
And that was, yeah, it can be soul destroying work, but it's better to get it at that early stage, because if you just put it off and put it off and put it off, the work only gets harder. It gets more challenging. They're suffering from a lot of different angles, these bugs. But yeah, the invasive species one is a massive problem. Rhododendron is a huge issue, especially lowland raised bogs like Peatlands Park and the fairy water bogs. They suffered really badly. It just chokes them, completely chokes them out.
Wow. And what about the burning? Is that also another problem? Right?
Yeah. Burning is another problem to add to this really depressing list. So yeah, I mean, historically, bogs would have been burnt for a variety of different reasons. So I mean, in an upland context and a blanket bog context, then they would have been burnt to improve conditions for grazing. In a lowland raised bog context, they would have been burnt to facilitate turf cutting. So if you want to cut turf, the two big things that you're going to do is you're going to put in drains to lower the water table, and then you're going to burn it to stop the vegetation from growing on it. That way you get nice, kind of easy to manage blocks of turf that you can move around. But the big problem that has happened with the burning is that historically people would have burnt bogs small scale on rotation. So there was a real sort of tradition there and a knowledge there that you would burn something that was maybe a size of maybe like half an acre or something like that there of a bog 1 year. I know, and that's where you would cut your turf, and then you would leave that for 3, 4, 5 years, and then you would each year you would burn a different bit, and then by the time that rotation had come back around, then the bit that you had burnt 5 years ago didn't show any signs that it had been burnt 5 years ago. It was always small scale, didn't have that much of an impact. Now, what tends to happen is that areas are set fire to, and then fire just runs riot. So we have a combination of a couple of things. That, the management side of things that has changed because the tradition has been lost. And climate change means that we often see really dry, persistent conditions that allow bogs to dry out to the point where fire becomes very likely and very damaging.
But then, is it a fire that starts on the natural reasons, or is it like always someone throws the match?
I would be of the belief that there is very, very few, if any, natural fires in our climate, in our island. I don't think that I mean, lightning strikes and that sort of stuff. I mean, things that start fires in somewhere like California, it's not. We just don't get that here. It's not part of the ecology. It's not part of the geography. So I would say in 99.9% of cases, it is started deliberately. I mean, it could be the deliberate nature of it varies wildly. I mean, you could get people that do it for land management, like for turf cutting or whatever, or you can just get it simply done for arson, or it might be accidental. You might have somebody that's burning hedge cuttings in a farm field somewhere, and then embers drift off into the land.
Portable barbecues.
Or portable, but definitely portable barbecues. That's a big problem. But yeah, you can get people that just do it for sheer badness. I know that some of the fires that we've recently had in the Belfast Hills there over the past wee while, people have just done it just because they wanted to set fire to huge areas of ground. Yeah, just for kicks. So, but no, I definitely think natural fires, not really something I wholeheartedly believe in.
Yeah,
in this part of the world.
So are the fires also a problem on the bogs that you guys working on as a part of CANN project, or is it, because that would mean that there maybe the follow-up question is like, are those bogs that you work on are also used for grazing? Are they actively used? Because you said, like, yeah, some of the people, they're not even interested, like, yeah, it's there, do whatever you want. But are you also working on the bogs that are actively used for grazing or something else, in which case this becomes a problem?
The ones that we've worked on through the CANN project don't tend to be grazed. So the vast majority of them people tend to stay off, partly because not because they're prevented from grazing them, but because they just don't want to, because they don't see any real kind of forage value in it for animals, and that's probably not far wrong, to be honest. And the risks, I mean, the risks of losing sheep or cattle within drainage channels is very real. In fact, we have had a couple of examples of farmers that, have had stock that have got through fences onto a bog, and one farmer right near Drumquin who nearly lost a bull on one of our sites, who fell into a bit of a drain, and then he ended up having to get a tractor out and pulling it out with a set of straps. So they tend to actually stay away from them because they don't tend to be worth what you would get from them in terms of grazing. But we have had sites that have suffered from fire. And I would actually say that these have probably been more towards the arson end of things, the deliberate for kicks kind of situation. So a couple of sites, that one site that I mentioned there, Cranny Bogs near Roma, it was burnt very badly at the very start of the project in 2017. And the crazy thing about it was that the bog is actually the site is kind of split in the middle by this little drumlin, which divides two bogs from each other. And then there's a third bog, which is literally down the road. And all of them were burnt. So it's not the case of one spreading to another. This is somebody actively going around and setting fire to these. And there's no grazing. There's no nothing. There's no turf cutting anymore. Sometimes I think there's the vandalism side of it, as people doing for the kicks. Also, I think part of it is so embedded in certain cultures, in certain communities, that people almost feel like it just should be done. It's almost like a tidiness thing, like they just feel like, oh, that bog needs a good burn. That just needs a good burn. Like a heather's getting very leggy on there. It just needs a good knockback. I'll go out and I'll get it done one day. But then you get neighbours who are terrified because you get really intense flames, I had one farmer there on that site that had flames that were maybe about 20, 30 yards away from the back of his shed, and he was sitting there calling the fire brigade, terrified that this was going to lick up and, start setting fire to his house. So
it's a real
it is
danger.
An issue. Oh yeah. And actually, in the lowland raised bog context, it can often be a much greater risk to like people and property. Whenever these fires tend to happen in upland context and blanket bogs, they tend to be quite remote, and then it is actually quite hard to really garner that sense of danger from people because they think, oh well, it's up on the hill, it's far away, it's never going to do any harm. But in these lowland contexts, you do, because of the way our rural communities are kind of scattered about the landscape, and you get houses next to places like this, it is a real problem. I mean, it could spread very, very, very easily into places where there are people.
All right. So we covered a lot of risks. Are there any other risks that are, like a top 5?
Yeah, drainage, invasive species, and fire are probably that's the top 3. Those are the big problems. But I mean, you do get other problems that aren't maybe quite as big, but they still cause issues. Things like recreational damage on sites. A lot of people don't even think about, a couple of footprints doesn't really make that much of damage or make that much of an imprint. But if you have a couple of footprints every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, bogs. The one thing that bogs have a problem with is that they are very sensitive to trampling.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they don't like a lot of trampling, and I mean, you can see this very easily whenever we go out to sites. If you stand in somewhere very soft on a bog, then I mean, if you don't go back to that for 3 weeks, a month, you can go back and that imprint is still there, exactly the same place that you left it, and it hasn't changed, it hasn't shifted. So particularly some of the moss species that we get on these sites, if they get repeated trampling, it's the same from livestock. I mean, it can cause the damage in the same way, but people can do it if they're in sufficient numbers. And then that also brings on the added risks with things like arson and everything alongside of it. But it's a shame. It's a real balance to strike because if people don't have access to the sites, then they can't enjoy them, they can't appreciate them. But it's trying to manage them.
Yeah, it's always the issue is with in a scale, right? It's with everything, like you said, like a 1-2, people or occurrences of some actions, that's fine. 10, 20, 100, 200, right? Then you start talking about thousands. Like, no, that is the problem. All right, listen. So Simon, tell us where the project is right now, because as far as I understand, the project will conclude in a very near future. So tell us, like, where, how would you describe, how much you guys managed to achieve, and where the project is, and what is going to happen after the project is concluded, because that was also one of the things, that the important thing is for certain of these actions to continue after the project finishes, because this is the big problem, that there's an action, there's money, there's a project, and the project finishes, and then everything goes back to where it was. So as far as I understand, you guys are taking that into consideration and trying to kind of ensure that the good work will continue.
100%. That's always one of the biggest problems. Organizations like ourselves and projects like the CANN project, you get a big lump of money, and then you go and spend it all, and 3 or 4 or 5 years goes by, and then see you later, you're away. The people that have got to know the local folks on the ground disappear. They get different jobs because they're in short-term contracts. It's a real problem. It's not just a problem in our case. It's a real problem across the conservation sector in both the Republic of Ireland and the UK. So we basically have got to the point now where there's a number of months until the project finishes up, and a lot of our work on the ground is kind of done and dusted. So a lot of the drain blocking, the invasive species removal, all that sort of stuff is really finished. We've got a little bit, kind of the cherries on the cake still to do, with a little bit of money that's left over in some places. So a few more dams to go in on Gary Bog up in North Antrim there later in the year. But we've kind of got to the stage where a lot of the on-ground stuff is done. So what we would like to do now, the other aspect of our project that we've been working on is these things called conservation action plans. And this is something that the government is obligated to do for all of its designated sites, for all its special areas of conservation. And these action plans basically documents that highlight all of the pressures and the threats to the sites, to the site's features. So on an active raised bog, it's what are the issues that are causing damage or causing harm to the active raised bog habitat. So that's drainage, that's invasive species, that's burning, that's whatever. And then the actions outlined in order to try and move them towards and maintain them in favourable condition status. So the drain blocking, the removal of the invasive species, the prevention of burning, wildfire management plans, all that sort of stuff. So we have now developed conservation action plans for all of these sites, for all the lowland raised bogs and the other sites in the CANN project. And that now really gives us a roadmap for us to work off. So even though the CANN project has been going on for 5 years and we've done lots of stuff on the ground, these documents are actually really more the start of the next step. So we've worked with landowners, we've worked with local communities to develop these plans. And this is now what we're going to use basically to move forward. So we know all the stuff that needs to be done now. We just need to find the funding in order to go and do it. So these documents, these conservation action plans, are what we're going to use to bring to, whether it's the EU or to the governments to get national funding or European funding to try and do more work. And what we really don't want to do, we were touching on before, is kind of having parachuted into these places. We don't want to just then run away from them, these sites that we've already worked on. And one thing that we would love to see is having officers on the ground, people that are dedicated to particular sites. Because one thing that we've seen has got a lot of goodwill from local communities and local landowners is having like a point of contact that you know, rather than some kind of like amorphous state body, you know, that you ring some 0800 number and you get a random person that you don't know.
Personal relation.
Exactly.
Important.
So somebody that you know by name that you can call upon to say like, okay, well, something's going on the bog, I'll ring Simon, you know. That's something we would love to see going forward. And it may not be a reality. It may well cost too much. It may require too much resources. But it's something that we're going to be really strongly advocating for going forward because it's worked so well.
So that's the recipe to continue that work outside of CANN project. So CANN project will be finished by then. But then you have those conservation action plans, and as long as you get funding for it, you can continue the work.
That's basically it. Yeah, so we now, like I said, we have the roadmaps, we have the conservation action plans that will help us then target the funding, and all of those actions are prioritized. So we know where the kind of the triage situations are, the places that we need to really dive into quickly so that it doesn't get worse. And what actions are more sort of on the back burner, on the long finger kind of thing, that can be left for a while. So what we are basically doing now is using those plans to say, okay, we need this amount of money to do exactly this kind of work on this exact site. And while we're doing that, then we're kind of simultaneously trying to gather the baseline information for other sites that we haven't worked on yet. So it's kind of like this continuously evolving thing whereby we've got all the baseline data, you know, like the hydrological information and the survey work done on a lot of these sites now, and we're working towards really pushing them towards favourable condition. But while we're doing that, we also want to be continuously kind of gathering that same information for other places, so that then longer term, in a few years down the line, we can start to do the same sorts of actions on other sites. Because, I mean, something crazy like 82% of our designated peatlands, or actually no, 82% of our peatlands in general in Northern Ireland are in bad condition. So, I mean, that's a staggering number, really. And a lot of our lowland raised bogs would be in unfavourable condition anyway, whether that's through historical turf cutting or burning or whatever it is. So really, the CANN project focused on SACs, and that's great because they're the best quality things, the things that we probably should sort out first. But really, from an Ulster Wildlife perspective, going forward, we want to see then other areas being brought in. So in Northern Ireland, that's areas of special scientific interest, the ASSIs, which are the kind of the nationally designated areas, and then areas that aren't designated at all. You know, there's so much peatland out there that doesn't have any actual protection to it, which arguably is more at risk. because there's nothing stopping anybody from improving it for agriculture or whatever. So that's the kind of the picture going forward, the legacy that we would like to see beyond the CANN project.
Right. And is there any way to support that? So is there any way to help you get the money or anything like that? Or is it really something up to you and, basically trying to get money from the governmental bodies? Is there an option to like do GoFundMe campaign?
I mean, it's not a sort of outlandish kind of suggestion. Realistically, there's a lot of situations where locally that stuff can be done very well with locally done funding. I mean, there's projects in Scotland where communities have actually created GoFundMe pages or crowdfunding pages to carry out restoration work on a site that means a lot to them. So that's something I think actually could become more mainstream. Here we haven't seen it much yet, but it could become more mainstream. For us, because of the scale that we're looking at, we're talking quite a lot of resources. So it's realistically going to fall to governments in order to provide that kind of resource. But the thing that people can do really is to properly understand and be aware of the importance of peatlands and lowland raised bogs. And the more that people understand it, the more they value these kinds of habitats, then the more willing and motivated governments will be to fund it. So if they see that communities want to see lowland raised bogs in their area restored, then communities should push their governments, both locally and nationally, to see that happen. So we know what we want to do. We just need the people with the resources in order to give us it to do it. But if there's more than just us shouting at the governments in order to see that happen, then it will happen faster and on a bigger scale. So I think that's the key message that people can do is if there's an opportunity for you to say that you want more of this stuff being done to somebody that makes decisions, then do it, because it will filter through.
For sure. And I'm sure that our listeners will also, in reality, most of the listeners are already people who know those things already.
Yeah.
But, I always say that one of the things is that through the podcast and through the things like that, we reaching towards new audiences and new people. And if there's only one person, if there's even one person who after listening to this, say, oh, actually, that's pretty valuable. And then we'll raise that on the in their local community or somewhere. That's already a value. It's fantastic job. Congratulations on all that you do. This is really great. Thanks for your time. I wish you guys all the best, and hopefully you will get the required funding and continue your fantastic work. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity being on here. It's been amazingly exciting being on the other side.